In 1962, Rikidozan, the so-called father of Japanese professional wrestling, went to Los Angeles and beat classy Freddie Blassie for the WWA World Heavyweight Championship. A month later, they had a rematch on live Japanese television. Blassie, a big heel in those days, had a habit of biting his opponents in the ring, drawing copious amounts of blood with his supposedly filed-down teeth, and during the rematch, he did just that, leaving Rikidozan drenched in his own blood. Fortunately for Japanese fans, Rikidozan still won the match, but it would go down in infamy as the Japanese media was heavily criticized for sensationalizing violence in the race for higher ratings, with dubious rumors abound of elderly viewers having heart attacks when they saw their national wrestling hero bleeding from the face on live TV. One man who agreed with this criticism of Japanese culture was Ishiro Honda, the legendary director of the original Godzilla. Therefore, when Toho tapped him to make a new sequel to Godzilla, and to make it more comedic, he knew exactly what he wanted to satirize. Godzilla has escaped his icy prison and set his sights on Japan, leaving nothing but death and destruction in his wake. While the Japanese military struggles to find a way to stop him, a pharmaceutical company looking for a publicity gimmick sends a team to Faroe Island, where reports of a godlike being have been making waves. There, they discover King Kong, but before they can use him to boost brand recognition for some drugs, Kong is co-opted into a title bout against Godzilla as a last-ditch effort to save Tokyo. Godzilla producer Tomoyuki Tanaka and special effects icon Eiji Tsuburaya wanted to make a King Kong movie as early as 1954, the same year that Godzilla was first unleashed upon Japan. However, the struggling RKO Studios didn't want to give up the rights to the property. A few years later, as RKO essentially collapsed as a production studio, the American special effects legend Willis O'Brien, the same man who had first brought King Kong to life on screen, came up with the concept for a blockbuster King Kong sequel in which the giant ape would face off against an enlarged Frankenstein's monster in the streets of San Francisco. With the blessing of whatever remained of RKO at the time, O'Brien took this treatment, eventually called King Kong vs. Prometheus, to producer John Beck in order to shop it around to other studios. Beck brought in screenwriter George Worthing Yates to turn it into a full script, and then got to work finding a production studio. The thing you have to understand about John Beck is that he was a silver-tongued deal-maker. Not only did he produce such hits as Harvey and The Singing Nun, he was also instrumental in the merger between Universal Pictures and International Pictures, one of the biggest mergers in Hollywood history. After failing to find an American studio willing to produce the project due to the costly special effects, Beck offered it, behind Willis O'Brien's back, to Toho in Japan. Once O'Brien found out about this, he tried to sue Beck, but then passed away a few months before King Kong vs. Godzilla was released. Enraged by the whole thing, Miriam C. Cooper, director of the original King Kong, also tried to sue Beck, this time to prevent the American release, but he failed due to lack of standing. For its part, Toho was eager to make the new King Kong script, even though the rights to Kong ultimately cost 80 million yen, half the movie's final budget. The studio heads had been looking for a way to revive Godzilla among the kaiju movie boom, and so they swapped out Frankenstein's monster in favor of Japan's most famous monster, figuring a fight with the eighth wonder of the world would be a grand enough event to justify Godzilla's return at the 30th anniversary of the studio. Eiji Tsuburaya postponed multiple projects as soon as he heard about this, not willing to pass up the chance to work on the King Kong movie he'd been dreaming of since he first saw the 1933 original. Ishiro Honda, who had skipped Godzilla's first sequel, Godzilla Raids Again, returned to direct this one, and he was given a mandate by the studio to make it more comedic and family-friendly. Honda was reluctant to take on a lighter tone, but producer Tomoyuki Tanaka was enthusiastic about it, even making decisions that the rest of the production team found bafflingly silly. To rework the screenplay, Honda turned to screenwriter Shinichi Sekizawa, with whom he had just worked on Mothra, and who had valuable experience working in television. As a side note, the idea of a gigantic Frankenstein's monster was revived by Toho for Frankenstein vs. Baragon and its pseudo-sequel The War of the Gargantuas. And don't worry, I'll make sure they're on my list. The main character, Osamu Sakurai, is played by Tadao Takashima, a jazz musician whose previous acting credits included Shinichi Sekizawa's Fearful Attack of the Flying Saucers. Toho staples Kenji Sahara and Yu Fujiki play main characters Osamu Fujita and Kinsaburo Furu, respectively, while future Bond girls Mia Hama and Akiko Wakabayashi play Fumiko Sakurai and Tammy. The great Akihiko Harata plays the defense minister Shigezawa, and this ship's captain is played by Yoshifumi Tajima. As for the titular monsters, they are played mostly by suit actors Shoichi Hirose and Haruo Nakajima, with Katsumi Tezuka backing up the latter as Godzilla. The actors were encouraged by Eiji Tsuburaya to improvise much of the action and to take inspiration from Japanese professional wrestlers Toyonbori and the aforementioned Rikidozan. Nakajima, in the Godzilla suit, was injured during this climactic fall, in which he hit his head and was knocked out as he tumbled into the water. He also has a cameo earlier in the movie as one of these islanders in the Watchtower. A lot of the film's ambition had to be toned down due to the machinations of John Beck, who had initially agreed to pay half the cost of King Kong's rights from RKO, but pulled out of that deal at the last minute, forcing Toho to pay the full amount. This is usually cited as the main reason why Kong looks the way he does, but to be fair, Tsuburaya reportedly rejected dozens of other designs before settling on the one seen in the film, and he was constrained by RKO to make sure Kong's face looked nothing like the OG, and he was further constrained by Toho's demands for monsters that weren't too terrifying for small children. I don't know about you though, but I think this face is way more terrifying than the original. Tsuburaya also toyed with the idea of using stop-motion animation as an homage to the original King Kong, but it was deemed too costly and time-consuming. However, there are a couple of scenes that use the effect in the final film. The movie was also intended to be shot on location in Sri Lanka, then Ceylon, but they switched to the Japanese island of Izu Oshima to cut costs. King Kong vs. Godzilla released in Japan in August of 1962, and it was an enormous event. Though there aren't reliable box office figures for it, its initial domestic run did secure an attendance of over 11 million, making it the most viewed Godzilla movie in Japan of all time. For comparison, the recent Godzilla -1, considered wildly successful, only had an attendance of just over 5 million. There was talk of a direct sequel in which the pair would fight again, but this was dropped in favor of pitting Godzilla against Mothra, whereas Kong wouldn't return until the wacky King Kong Escapes, which I've already covered on this channel. You should check it out. John Beck, as part of his deal with Toho, was in charge of the American recut and distribution of King Kong vs. Godzilla. A new cast was assembled to add a newscast framing device, and the film was chopped up and put back together with dubbing that focuses more on matching up lip movements than on being coherent.
Faroe Island. There, gentlemen, is where I found the red berries and the strange god.
Ooh, strange story, Mr. Makino.
Of all the Americanizations of classic Toho tokusatsu movies, This is probably among my least favorites. The framing device is just people mindlessly telling us what is happening, even though we can see it with our own eyes, and the continuity makes a lot less sense. Add in the weird dubbing and dialogue changes, and it really is terrible. Unfortunately, though, this is the version most American audiences know, and it is still largely the only version available on American home video, though you can find the Japanese version in the Criterion Showa-era box set and as a standalone Blu-ray. The American version, though, was a smash hit in the US when it released in June of 1963, raking in a hefty box office for Universal International and earning a fair amount of critical praise. But now we get to the part where a lot of G fans are going to disagree with me. When it comes to the Showa era of Godzilla films, this is far from the worst, but I also don't think it deserves its reputation as one of the best. It doesn't reach the heights of more serious films like the original Godzilla or Mothra vs. Godzilla, nor is it as fun to watch as the completely goofy Godzilla vs. Megalon. I grant that it helped solidify the main event formula started by Godzilla Raids Again, and it was the first Godzilla movie to start embracing the family-friendly silliness it would later become known for. I'll also acknowledge that a lot of my negativity around King Kong vs. Godzilla stems from the fact that, until very recently, I'd never seen the true Japanese cut. But to me, even in that form, it's not that great. Yes, I love King Kong, and yes, I love Godzilla, but I just think this movie is too messy, that it is vastly overshadowed by the movies that followed in its footsteps, and that even Honda's satirical stance on Japanese television, which mind you was nothing compared to more modern Japanese television, doesn't save it. It's popular to throw shade at Kong's design, and trust me, I do dislike it, but given what I know now about the budget struggle behind the scenes, that's something I can actually forgive. However, the plot has its oddities, like Kong being powered up by electricity, a holdover from earlier scripts where Frankenstein's monster was powered up that way. Now I know the Showa era is chock full of weird stuff like that. Don't worry, I'll talk about Hetero one of these days. But this is the first time it feels like the writer just didn't care enough to come up with a better plot device to give Kong a leg up. Also, I don't care what Toho says, there's no way Godzilla could lose to a big ape, even if you give him magical electricity powers. Nevertheless, I won't deny that King Kong vs. Godzilla has an honored place in the Godzilla canon, and it really solidified Toho's kaiju movies as a persistent, dominant force in Japanese culture. In other words, as much as I can nitpick it for not being as great as everybody seems to think it is, and always will be, a sci-fi classic. And that's all for today, my fellow Earthlings. Who do you think should have won, King Kong or Godzilla? Let me know in the comments, and while you're down there, don't forget to hit those like and subscribe buttons. Thank you for watching, and until next time when we'll shake a tail feather or two, this is the Unapologetic Geek telling you to never be ashamed of what you love. As long as you're not hurting anybody.
Oh, if your mommy knew. You better not smoke it around home.